Good morning, everyone. This is Mike Cranky with the Sustainable Forest Education Cooperative in Cloquet, Minnesota. We have 34 people online today, along with Tony D'Amato, our presenter, and also party with Iowa State University, who is helping us. So it's another cold, wintry day. Not snow, but it's a nice, clear day out. So hopefully everything is going well from your end. So what I'm going to do today is give a few logistics like I normally do, and then I'm going to introduce Tony, and then at the end of the session, if you have additional questions, take some time for questions and answers. So as far as the logistics, if you look on your screen, on the left-hand side, right below Tony's photograph, you'll see a chat pod. And if you click onto that chat pod at any time during Tony's presentation, you can type in your questions and then click on that little arrow that goes down and to the left. Then Tony will be able to see your questions and he'll be able to answer them as he's presenting. So one other thing, if you want continuing forest education credits either for certified forestry or stewardship plan writer, make sure to indicate that in either the attendee list, which many of you have already done, or top by the chat. So with that in mind, our webinar is about an hour long. This is the 10th in a series of webinars throughout the year. Tony has done about 4 webinars for the Sustainable Forest Education Cooperative, so most of you are familiar with Tony and his work and presentation. So I'll introduce Tony. Our topic is current status and long-term trends of silvicultural practices. Tony D'Amato is an assistant professor of silviculture and applied forest ecology at the University of Minnesota and the Department of Forest Resources. Dr. Tony D'Amato conducts research on traditional and experimental silvicultural strategies for meeting diverse forest management objectives, ranging from the production of woody biomass for biofuels to the maintenance of native biodiversity and ecological complexity within managed forests. Prior to coming to the University of Minnesota in 2007, he was a postdoctorate research associate in the Department of Natural Resources at the University of Massachusetts. Dr. D'Amato has a PhD in Forest Resources, 2007, from the University of Massachusetts, an MS in Forest Science, 2002, Oregon State University, a BS in Forest Ecosystem Science, 2000, from the University of Maine. He also served as a research associate at Harvard University's Harvard Forest from 2002 to 2006. So we're really happy to have Tony online with us today to present current status and trends in silvicultural practices in Minnesota. So Tony, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Mike, and thanks, folks, for being online today. As Mike said, I've given a few webinars, but it's tough for me. I like seeing people's faces, but I think for everybody it's a little more convenient to do it this way. And feel free as I'm going through this, even though obviously we're not sitting in a room, people raising hands. If you have questions or need something clarified, feel free to use the chat pod to interject a question if you have need any clarification as we go through. What I'm going to be doing today is giving an overview of some work that has been ongoing here at the University of Minnesota really over the past 15 years, trying to get a sense of what the current status is of silvicultural practices at different points in time, and really trying to piece together what has been the general trend in what we're doing out in the landscape in the state of Minnesota. And so I just want to acknowledge the other folks that have been working on this. Nick Bolton, a former graduate student here, Charlie Blinn and Alan Eck, both faculty members here in the Department of Forest Resources. And this also received funding from the Interagency Information Cooperative, which is also housed here at the University of Minnesota. So Minnesota is relatively unique, really compared to any other state in the country, in that we've actually had formal surveys of our silvicultural practices at multiple points in time. Actually, most folks online are familiar with the generic environmental impact statement that occurred in the early 90s. As part of that assessment in 1991, we did a statewide survey of what really are the current status of practices to give us some sort of baseline to understand how silviculture would be practicing in the state. That was followed up in 1996, and some folks might be familiar with a Northern Journal of Applied Forestry paper that came out in 1999 by Klaus Putman and Alan Eck, which basically was reporting how things had changed between 1991 and 1996 in terms of silvicultural practices. There was a bit of a lull, and we really hadn't taken kind of the heartbeat of what's been going on in the landscape for quite a period of time. And so in 2008, we were asked by the Interagency Information Cooperative to basically generate another survey that will assess, how have things changed and, what do things look like. And so what I'll be presenting today really is building upon those earlier surveys and also presenting some of the recent findings from a survey that was administered in 2009 that is basically a snapshot of how things were occurring in the state in 2008, which even now seems a long time ago, but certainly gives us a flavor of what are some of the more modern and kind of contemporary practices happening and how those shifted since the early 90s. And just as a point of practice, basically the exact same methodology, same survey recipients that were surveyed in 1991-96 were surveyed in 2008. And so what you'll be seeing today is really kind of following these same ownerships over time and seeing how have things changed across those ownerships. Before we get into talking about the survey and kind of the results, I think it's important just to remind ourselves that even though 1996 seems just a few days ago, I think it was Brett Favre's 13th year in the league, basically, we certainly have had a lot of important changes that have occurred in the state of Minnesota and really across the country in terms of how our forestry practices have been implemented. And so as we go through and start talking about some of these results today and thinking about what's happening in the state in terms of silviculture, it's important to think about how things have shifted in terms of how we do things, both on the ground as well as some of the economic and ecological changes. And so one of the more important changes that's occurred since 1996 is that we have now formally adopted site-level guidelines for the state. Basically, those were ratified and adopted in the late 90s after the last survey was done. And so certainly now folks view this as kind of standard operating procedure, but at the time, in the mid-90s, these were not being widely applied or widely embraced by all agencies in the landscape. Also, in 1996, people would have thought bioenergy was a thing of the past. That was something that people were excited about in the late 70s and early 80s. But again, we're seeing that shift come back and really a huge interest now in using forest-derived bioenergy. Certainly, Minnesota has always had some burners in the state, but more and more interest in establishing new plants as well as other ways to use forest-derived fuels. Certainly, ecological classification systems were being developed in the 90s, but really it hasn't been until the last few years where we've seen widespread use of particularly the DNRs, native plant community classifications, to really think about how we would manage a system or actually classify our approach to silviculture in the landscape. Unfortunately, we've seen certainly a major reduction in stumpage prices, particularly since the mid-2000s. Also, demand's gone way down. Costs certainly are to the OSB plants in the state as well as other potential markets. One thing that I'll also refer back to is we certainly, cut the length technology was on the landscape in the mid-90s, but we've certainly seen even more mechanization of our logging force, particularly in some regards in response to the higher stumpage prices we were seeing it for a certain period of time. And then finally, something I'm going to also really refer back to is that in 1996, when you would say that somebody had an industrial land ownership, everybody understood it was one certain flavor of land ownership. But now, since the 90s, we've had kind of a split of industry land ownership where now we don't have just traditional industry lands like UPM, Kemeny, Blandon lands, but we certainly have real estate investment trusts, timber investment management organizations within the state of Minnesota, and they certainly operate very differently than what a traditional industry ownership would operate like. So I'll be kind of referring back to that as we go through. So just to give you a sense of who these people are, I'm going to be talking about who are the folks that responded to the survey. Basically, I'm going to be focusing in on kind of the large public and industry ownerships. We had 26 total respondents to the survey, and basically that captured state, federal, 14 counties, 3 industry ownerships. Again, 2 of those industry ownerships, one is a REIT and one is a TIMO, so they're not kind of traditional private industry, and then 5 tribal ownerships. We also tried to get a snapshot of what was happening on family forest lands, but given the diversity of ownerships and just the number of folks that own private forest land in Minnesota, it was virtually impossible to do that. And so really what I'll be talking about today are these main ownerships that are listed on the screen. To give you a sense, that's about 64% of our total timberland in the state, so a pretty good representation of what's happening over the larger land base. So thinking about just harvest levels, and those who practicing forestry are well aware of this, in 2008 we certainly saw kind of a decline in harvest levels relative to what was certainly occurring earlier in 2000s, as well as within the mid-90s. Basically, the survey that we did captured about 67% of the total statewide harvest that year, and so again, what we're reporting on is a pretty large proportion of what the activity was in the state of Minnesota in 2008. If you look at just kind of the overall amount of harvesting happening across the total timberland acres in Minnesota, basically in 1996 there was much more volume being removed per timberland acre than there was in 2008. And so we were removing about 0.2 of a cord per acre in 2008 versus about 1/4 of a cord per acre in 96. And really that's just kind of looking at total timberland and total area harvested. But if we actually look at, we ask folks to report what's the average volume coming off per acre harvested on your land base. And what we generally see is that there was a general decline in the overall intensity of management happening. Basically, in 1996, if someone was to harvest an area, the average cords per acre coming off that area was about 20 cords per acre, whereas in 2008, we were seeing only about 16 cords per acre coming off per given harvest. And really what this is reflecting is some of the things I'll be alluding to later on, in that we're certainly leaving a lot more behind in these areas, both in retaining living trees as well as also using silvicultural systems that aren't based on complete harvest of merchantable timber. And so we're seeing a decline in just the amount of cords being removed over time. So what I'm going to do is go through a series of tables, and basically what these tables will be doing is comparing what the values were in 2008 with 1996. 1991 also was a survey year, but they weren't as comprehensive in all the things they sampled. So I'm really just going to compare over a 12-year period how things shifted. The first kind of series of things I'm going to present are silvicultural systems. That is, what's kind of the predominant reproduction method being used in the land base, and I'll also include some other information about intermediate treatments as well. And so it's no surprise to those of you that work out in the landscape of Minnesota, our predominant reproduction system still being done out there is clear cutting. Basically, if we look at kind of the total numbers, so these are just acres, and then in parentheses next to the numbers, just the percentage of total acres treated. So basically this first number here, 2,870 acres, represents 42% of all acres that was treated. And so in 2008 and 1996, both times we looked at Minnesota's land base, certainly the predominant form of silvicultural system being used as a clear-cutting based system. What's interesting is we actually see in 2008 that the vast majority of our clear cuts are actually over 40 acres. We've actually seen an increase in the total acreage, the average clear cut size, as well as kind of the way that clear cuts are being implemented. A few of the respondents had the opportunity, would actually put in some additional information about this. Essentially, we're saying, particularly on some of our federal lands as well as some of the state lands, in that they were trying to get back to kind of putting some of these larger patch sizes on the landscape, as well as obviously the operational efficiencies of having larger harvest blocks versus a lot of small harvest blocks. One other important thing to look at here is that even though it's only a 1% increase, we have seen a jump in the amount of kind of what we call partial harvest-based reproduction methods, seed tree, shelter wood, single tree selection, and group selection. And so even though we have a lot of clear-cutting based systems happening, we certainly have a lot of small clear-cut, kind of patch clear-cuts, which are just less than 6-acre clear-cuts, as well as also an increase in just the amount of other reproduction methods being used on the land base. Beyond looking at kind of reproduction methods and silvicultural systems, there's certainly a considerable amount of interest right now in intermediate treatments. Many of you may have attended the recent intermediate treatment workshop this past September. There's a lot of focus right now, both in Minnesota and across the lake states, on how intermediate treatments, particularly things like thinning as well as release treatments, can be used to enhance the productivity and health of our forests. And so we are very curious to see, are we seeing this reflected in what's actually happening on the land base? And if you compare 1996 to 2008, we saw an increase in the amount of commercial thinning, basically about a 3% increase in the amount of commercial thinning happening between 96 and 2008. What's interesting is we actually saw a decline in pre-commercial thinning. Basically, only about half the amount of acres that were pre-commercially thinned in 1996 were pre-commercially thinned in 2008. And so even though we're doing a lot more thinning on the landscape, it's really being focused on those commercial treatments. And there's a couple of reasons why we might be seeing this increase in commercial thinning. Certainly, as I mentioned before, we have a lot more cut-to-length operators on the landscape. This happens to be a cut-to-length system that's owned by the Fond du Lac Band in Cloquet. And basically, the ability to thin stands with this type of machinery relative to some of our other harvesting configurations is greatly enhanced. Also, just thinking about the land base of Minnesota, we have a lot of plantations that are kind of boundary waters era origin that are now coming up for their first thinning, and so there's a lot more of the land base that's now eligible for commercial thinning. And so we're certainly seeing kind of that reflected in the numbers, and given kind of the recent push for more thinning in the landscape, I wouldn't be surprised if in future surveys this number goes up even higher. What's surprising is that pre-commercial thinning has gone down quite a bit, and really what we saw in the numbers was that this is largely because many of our industry ownerships are no longer pre-commercially thinning, particularly the ownerships that are now TIMOs and REITs. Basically, when we got open-ended responses from our industry owners, they basically were saying that it's hard for them to justify those upfront costs to investors. And so in the past, when we often thought of, often most of our pre-commercial thinning would be occurring on the industrial land base. Now we're seeing particularly those owners that are no longer traditional industry ownerships, but are now responding to different types of investors. It's hard for them to justify those upfront costs. And another thing they also indicated as a hindrance to being able to pre-commercially thin is that many of our aspen stands, as a lot of you are familiar with, were formerly being pre-commercially thinned mechanically using machinery, basically doing strip thinning in those areas. And by having to leave behind residual trees, it becomes more challenging to actually go out there and implement those pre-commercial thinning treatments. And that was reflected in some of the comments from some of our respondents. Thinning is not the only form of intermediate treatments, although it certainly gets the most attention. Another important kind of class of intermediate treatments that we do in the land base are release treatments, basically treatments that are focused on trying to enhance the growth and reduce competition around our desired crop trees. And again, if we look at comparing numbers between 1996 and 2008, if we look at just total acres of release, we saw an increase in the amount of release that's happening out there in the land base. But what's interesting is that the way in which we're doing release is changing. If you just focus on chemical release methods, so just using herbicides to release individuals, in 1996, about half of our release was being done aerially, so using fixed-wing aircraft, helicopters, and planes, whereas the other half was being done ground-based operation, essentially with a skidder mounted with a sprayer. If you look at 2008, we've seen a decline in the amount of aerial release and an increase in the amount of ground-based release. And talking to the respondents to the survey, this is really reflecting a couple of things. In particular, it's reflecting the challenges that are imposed by having residual trees out in a cut block. Obviously, it's not easy to move aircraft through those areas, but also just general concerns that some folks have regarding how aerially released herbicides might affect the environment and so forth. What we've seen an increase in is manual release, and really this is largely happening on federal and state lands. We have some folks on here from the Forest Service, and many other folks might be familiar with the fact that you cannot use herbicides on federal lands, Forest Service lands within the lake states, based on an act passed in 1990. And so all release treatments happening on federal lands are being done using brush saws or other types of methods. We also saw quite a bit of manual release happening on state lands as well. And so a major increase in the amount of hand release happening out there on the land base. Again, reflecting in some regards what are policies across our federal forests, but also many of you are familiar with the certification process, particularly FSC certification is every year seems to be restricting the use of an additional herbicide. And so as we continue to have certification restrictions on what types of herbicides are allowed to be used and what aren't, we might see even more increase in the use of manual release as it becomes more challenging to do this with chemical methods. One of the areas that really changed looking at trends across the land base, beyond just seeing an increase in intermediate treatments, is that the way in which we're regenerating stands and what we're relying on for regeneration also is shifting quite a bit. And one of the things that was quite striking looking at what was happening in the land base in 1996 compared to 2008 was that there was a major shift and increase in the amount of planting occurring. And so again, in 1996, we planted about 11,500 acres, whereas in 2008, we planted over 21,000 acres. And so we're seeing a real increase in the amount of planting happening out there. Also an increase in the amount of direct seeding, increased almost 4,000 acres. The only decline we saw related to artificial regeneration really revolved around hybrid poplar. Certainly that's gone down, although it'd be interesting to see, depending on what happens with bioenergy markets as well as demand for that material, if we start seeing an increase again in short rotation woody crops on the land base, as has been seen in other parts of the lake states over the past few years. When looking at just what's being put out there, it's no surprise 97% of the trees that are being planted are conifers. What is interesting, just putting it in the context again of what may have been happening in the mid-90s, is that the majority of that material being put out is containerized stock. Many of our respondents were 100% containerized stock, and across those 26 respondents, over 70% of all seedlings being put out in the land base were containerized. And again, reflecting just how far that technology has come, as well as the ease at which we can now get that material and put it out in the land base, and certainly the advantages in terms of flexibility that type of stock provides. So again, a big shift, I would say, from what we were using for stock in the 90s in the land base. One of the things that also is fairly consistent, even though we saw a decline, most of the land base, if we are using natural regen, it's coming from sprouts and really coming from aspen suckers. It's about a 4,000 acre decline in the amount of area being regenerated back to aspen relative to 1996, but it's still a huge part of what we do. And again, many of those clear-cutting based systems that were talked about at the beginning of the talk, those are largely coppice systems that are relying on aspen reproduction. We saw a pretty substantial decline in the amount of natural reproduction coming from seed. And again, this might be reflecting a few things. One, given the amount of conifers being planted, folks are basically deciding it's a lot more predictable, a lot more straightforward if you want to get conifers back to essentially plant those conifers versus deal with some of the vagaries and challenges associated with relying on natural regen, particularly for our pine species where it's a bit unpredictable and often more straightforward to get those established via planting. But nonetheless, when we look at regen across the land base, it's no surprise to anybody that spends time in Minnesota that aspen still reigns supreme as kind of our predominant regeneration type across the landscape. Given the amount of planting, it's no surprise you would think we'd also see quite a bit more site preparation happening out there in the land base. We actually saw about a 4% decline in total acres of site prep happening, but when we look at kind of the way site prep is occurring, again, we see a shift. Here's 2008 compared to 1996. If we look at the aerial application of herbicides, only about 466 acres were done in 2008, whereas 1996 is a main form we were doing site prep on the land base. We're still doing plenty of herbicide application, just in more of a configuration like this, mounted on a ground-based operation. Prescribed burning remains a fairly low, rarely applied site preparation approach, whereas again, mechanical site prep is largely our main way we go about preparing sites. Even though there was a decline across our ownership sampled for site prep, we actually saw an increase of site prep being applied on state and county lands, and really the main ownership that was backing off of site preparation relative to the 90s was industry again. And basically what we were seeing on industry lands was that, again, those folks that are now TIMOs and REITs, certainly justifying all those upfront costs to get conifers established are often challenging now, looking at 10-year or 20-year profit horizon for many of their investors. And so in some of those cases, they're letting a lot of that land base come back to Aspen and spending less effort on site prep. So it's a major change in how that land base is being managed. One of the big kind of findings that came out of the last survey of silvicultural practices was just how much more is being left behind in clear cuts relative to 1991. So in 1996, they basically found that there's over a 30% increase in the amount of clear cuts that would classify as clear cuts with residuals relative to 96. So essentially, moving from clear cut conditions like this on the right to ones in which we have more retention. And so we were interested when we did the latest survey to see, now that we have these site level guidelines in place, certification and other mechanisms by which we're trying to enforce or see if those guidelines are being met in the landscape. We were curious to see if we'd see an even additional increase since 1996 in terms of the amount of retention of reserve trees happening on the land base in Minnesota. So what I've done here in this table, you basically have the main agencies that were surveyed across the top, and then the different rows correspond to, these are the amount of clear cuts that are greater than 5 acres that would have residuals. And so here's the total acreage, and then the number in percent parentheses is just the percent of all clear cuts that had residuals. So speaking on the state here, they had over 4,000 clear cuts. 78% of those, 70% of all their clear cuts had residuals. Sorry, 34,000 their clear cuts had residuals, which is 70% of all their clear cuts. And so looking across the different agencies, the one that sticks out the most is the federal agencies, basically our Forest Service lands. And the reason for this is the way that we framed the question in the survey was, it wasn't how many clear cuts do you have that would qualify for meeting the site level guidelines. Actually, it was how many clear cuts do you have that would qualify within your agency as being a clear cut with residuals. And so we asked several of the ownerships to basically have to indicate what does qualify as a clear cut with reserves. And some of the county folks said, 3 trees per acre, which is actually below the state level, site level guidelines. And the federal folks, particularly on the Chippewa, had a fairly high basal area that they needed to meet to even consider that a clear cut with residuals. And so in many regards, this 47% is an underestimate of what would meet the state site level guidelines. Most folks, clearly are leaving living trees. One thing that's a major shift from the mid-90s was that the total, across the total area sampled, about half the residuals are being left as scattered trees, whereas the other half are being left as clumped. In the original surveys that were done in the 90s, most, over 70% of reserve trees are being scattered. Folks are clearly recognizing both the ecological benefits of having clumped retention patterns as well as the operational efficiency of having aggregated trees versus dispersed trees. And, again, our industry folks basically were only leaving about 10% as scattered. Again, some of the responses were that it's much easier for them to operate when they have aggregated areas of reserves versus reserves dispersed throughout. The final thing we asked is in relation to guidelines dealt with just the riparian management areas. We didn't really get into exactly how much they're leaving behind in riparian areas or how many areas they're using buffers. But what we did want to know was, within your riparian zones, how much harvesting is happening within those areas. Again, we're allowed to harvest within riparian zones based on our guidelines, but we just want to know how many folks were. Across the state, about 32% of all riparian zones had harvesting activity, but it really varied across ownerships. Certainly our tribal lands, they had no activity in riparian zones. Same with federal lands, only about 3%, whereas industry, over 65% of their riparian zones had some level of harvesting activity. So just kind of giving you differences across ownerships in terms of who's doing what in these areas. In terms of just what folks said as reasons for leaving behind reserve trees, those of you that certainly are practicing foresters are well aware of some of the criteria that goes through your mind as you're leaving these elements out in the landscape. Certainly folks indicated habitat value if there's already existing cavities. Species, that worked 2 ways. One, if it was an underrepresented species, whether it be white pine or oak, or if it's a species that's of low value like red maple, that might get priority for being left behind, as well as just wind firmness. What's the likelihood of that tree standing for more than a few years out in those clear cuts? So again, definitely a minor increase in the amount of residuals being used, but what was most interesting was just how those residuals are being left out in the landscape, certainly much more clumping being done out there. One of the other kind of new issues that's come along since the 90s is that we're seeing certainly more biomass harvesting happening in the land base, and there's a lot of folks are trying to get a sense for how widespread is that and really in what ways is it being done. Unfortunately, because biomass is a relatively new thing, most agencies didn't have a formal way of keeping track of what was a biomass harvest versus a traditional roundwood harvest, or sales that were sold on appraised value. Basically, wasn't always clear as to where that material is going for some of the record keeping that was done. But given what we were able to get from the folks that do keep track of these harvests, again, this is definitely an underestimate, but it gives you at least a sense of some trends. We were able to get, obviously, from the state. Some counties kept track of it. The federal folks did keep track of it, and no biomass harvesting was occurring based on their records in 2008. A few industry respondents and a few tribal respondents were also able to keep track of it. And so these results are more of just a summary of what we were able to get responses from. But what we're seeing is just that the majority of harvests, in terms of state lands, it was on the first pass that biomass was being removed, so essentially that material is being skidded to a landing, and then at that point, being delimbed and fed to a tipper and into a van. Whereas on some county operations, there was basically a second pass going out and gathering that material. So a little bit of a difference there. Again, this is just tentative results. One thing that I thought was a bit interesting was that at least from this small sample, we're seeing 1 in 5 harvest operations were using more than just residuals or slash as a source of bioenergy. That is, roundwood was being used and sold as a source of biomass. And so as we start thinking about bioenergy and some of the concerns folks have about competition with other roundwood markets, it'll be interesting to see how these numbers may change over time. But again, this is just kind of a preliminary results. Only 13 of our 26 respondents had bookkeeping about biomass. So this is definitely an underestimate of what's happening out there. So a few other things. We had open-ended questions and kind of asked folks, what's the other issues facing you? And again, all of you that practice in the state are well aware that when you ask someone what's one of your biggest challenges, the word deer tends to rise to the top of the list. Depending on where the folks were based, the species that they were affecting varied, but in general, one of the main issues folks were bringing up was that sustained deer herbivory on conifers, but also in some cases on oak, were really limiting regeneration success, particularly for jack red and white pine, as well as cedar. And again, some of the more central counties were also indicating issues with oak as well. Another item that came up, several folks were indicating that in order to meet guidelines and kind of minimize site damage, many of the harvests are happening in the winter, even on sites that likely could be harvested in the fall or in the summer. And as a result, they're not getting the level of site disturbance on those sites that would be necessary to maintain species like paper birch or even some of the pines that do better on that exposed mineral soil seed bed. And across all of our harvest records that we looked at, almost 60% were done in the winter. And so folks were recognizing from a silvicultural standpoint, this might be limiting their ability to regenerate certain species. And the picture I have on the lower right-hand corner here is just an area that's been site prepped on St. Louis County lands using a salmon blade within paper birch as one alternative to trying to get around this issue. Even though the site's going to be harvested in the winter, they've been able to at least expose that mineral soil, get some seed catch, and then harvest with a snowpack to hopefully protect that regeneration. But nonetheless, where that isn't an option, we're seeing a challenge in terms of regenerating some of these species that need that site disturbance. So thinking about overall trends, what I'm going to do is just kind of go through some of the main trends we're seeing from 1991 to 2008. Just in summary, I'm not going to belabor this diagram. All this is an ordination. It looks at all the different variables simultaneously and tries to summarize what the main patterns are across the different ownerships. And so these different symbols correspond to different ownerships. These open symbols here are your county, state, and industry ownerships. These are the federal ownerships, and this is the Native American ownerships. Each one of these dots is just different point in time. So this is 1991, 96, and 2008. So kind of moving through that sequence are the 3 sample points. Overall, what you see is that the county, state, industry lands from a silvicultural standpoint are roughly similar. All of them harvesting fairly high level of volume, a lot more site prep, a lot more chemical application of both release and site prep, as well as a lot of these ownerships were historically relying quite a bit on aspen, whereas these areas over here represent less site prep, less chemical application, and so our federal lands and our Native American lands we tend to think of as certainly having lower intensity applications of those types of treatments. And I'm going to move beyond this and just talk about this more in bullet point form. But what this is showing is that we certainly do have some distinct types of application of treatments in the land base. And what's interesting is if you look at industry even, this is what it was doing in 1991, 1996, it shifted out here. Now it's actually reverting back towards what it was doing in the early 90s. So we're seeing kind of, in some cases, a shift in practice that's not moving to a new area, but actually going back towards what might have been occurring in the early 90s, particularly when some of the industry land base was relying more on natural regen versus conifers. So across the board, really, when we look at kind of the state of Minnesota and what's happening out there with silvicultural practices, one of the clear kind of differentiating factors between ownerships is that on our federal lands and on our tribal ownerships, we certainly see lower levels of site prep and also much lower levels of chemical-based treatments. Basically, again, due to policy, we don't have those opportunities on federal land base. What's interesting is that if we just pick on kind of the Forest Service lands in the state, what we've really seen is a major increase in emphasis on conifer establishment on the land base. A lot of planting activity, and in accordance with that planting activity, a lot of mechanical release. And when looking at kind of the reasons and justifications for this increase in conifer establishment, really the reasons are not to get fully stocked plantations for fiber production, but really more from an ecological standpoint. A lot of the objectives now across that federal land base are to try to restore some of these underrepresented upland conifer types. And so much of that planting really is from an ecological standpoint, trying to get some of these species back on the land base that are now underrepresented. Across all land bases, independent of the federal lands, we even on DNR lands, state, county lands, we're seeing again, based on what we saw in 2008, quite a bit more emphasis being put on planting. Certainly during the mid-90s and even early 2000s, we were accepting that aspen in regards from an economic standpoint, and now as we start to think more about long-term integrity of these areas, as well as trying to get some of these conifer species back on the land base, much more emphasis has gone into trying to plant those species. And unfortunately, in some cases, replant sites that have been hit by browse or other disease issues. We're also seeing certainly more partial cutting systems, whether it be the use of visual trees within clear-cut based system, or actually using things like shelter wood harvest or selection harvest on the land base. What's interesting, though, is that when we typically used to think of industry lands as the lands where we put a lot of money in upfront investments, certainly release treatments, improved planting stock, site preparation, and really what we've seen since 1996 is a major shift from that type of land model. Certainly on Blandon lands and UPM Kemeny lands, they're still invested in doing things like pre-commercial thinnings, and as well as other types of release treatments. But across the other industrial ownerships, we've seen a shift in the way they're approaching early stand management, which could have long-term impacts on just what's out there in the long run for future conifer plantations and so forth on the land base. Just to kind of highlight, this is 2008 numbers. This is some that I've been talking about today. This is just a graph from some work that Tim O'Hara and others pull together every year as part of the Minnesota SFI Program Implementation Committee. Basically, the only reason I'm pulling this up is, again, to highlight this y-axis is just the area regenerated relative to the area harvested, and so the higher the number, the higher amount of regeneration happening out there relative to harvesting. If we look at this Forest Service number in 2009, as I was mentioning before, just the amount of effort that's going into trying to regenerate areas, establish conifers in the land base was a tremendous increase. And Again, what this is likely reflecting in some respects is the stimulus money that some of the Forest Service, particularly the Superior National Forest, got towards timber stand improvement and forest restoration projects. And so as we start thinking about these results in the context of what's happening on a year-to-year basis, even this year alone, it's going to have a long-term impact on just what that land base looks like. We also see, even on DNR lands, an increase in the amount of regeneration effort out there relative to the amount of harvesting. And so certainly, even though 2009 was a leaner year economically, we're still seeing this type of emphasis on establishment of regeneration out there relative to overall harvesting on some of these land bases. So the major caveat for this presentation is that, again, this is 3 snapshots in time, 1991, 1996, 2008. 2008 looks like a wonderful year economically compared to 2010, which is hard to believe. And so as we think about a lot of the trends I presented today, many of them represent an investment, whether it be pre-commercial thinning, release treatments, planting seedlings. And so as we get into leaner and leaner budget times, see more and more cuts, how is that really going to influence what we see, particularly in those treatments that cost money? And what's also interesting is, as we see our industry land base change, traditionally we often viewed them as the areas where we had really high production, high investment. We could really produce fiber in an efficient, highly productive way. As that land base now is shifting away from one in which there's high investments, will we see kind of a more pressure being put on our other land bases, whether it be a state land base or county or federal land base, to kind of meet that demand as those industry lands start declining in their ability to be as productive. And so we'll start seeing kind of a shift in that demand to other parts of the land base. Beyond kind of that change in ownership, certainly there's a lot of things happening on the land base that are out of our control in many regards, certainly invasive species, both insect form like emerald ash borer, as well as plant form, everything from buckthorn, garlic mustard, thistle, things that certainly influence how effectively we're able to release seedlings or even get a community back to a certain condition. And so how will that, coupled with everybody's favorite issue du jour, heavy high deer browse across the land base, and certainly changing climatic conditions, will we change our silvicultural practices? And so when we do this survey in 5 years, will that be reflected, or will we still see things kind of focused more on getting seedlings out there on the land base and trying to meet certain guidelines? And then finally, along those lines, certainly bioenergy is something that even on a monthly basis, we see kind of the demand as well as the enthusiasm for ebb and flow. It's tough to get a full handle on how significant a player that will be on the land base in the future, but certainly all signs point to us increasing the amount of bioenergy harvesting happening out in the land base, and certainly that's going to influence how we approach silviculture, how we approach implementing guidelines, and so I'll be curious to see how that affects what we do in Minnesota as we go forward. And so I think one thing, take-home message, is looking even just over a 15 to 16-year period, there's certainly been a lot of change in response to both ecological and economic concerns, and really highlights just what we do silviculturally to try to adapt to those changes over time. So I just want to acknowledge the funding sources for this again, as well as all the folks that took time to fill out the survey. Some of you on the webinar might have been involved. I appreciate you not sending me hate mail for the 40-page survey we sent around. Those of you that want a full copy of this, there is a report on the Department of Forest Resources website. Staff paper number 205 really has all the statistics you can compare between 1991, 96, and 2008. It's available for free. Just download it off the website if you want more details. And I'd certainly welcome any questions or comments folks might have at this point.
Tony, this is Mike. As we're thinking about questions, I want to alert participants that we have a webinar coming up next year on Tom Levar, is a scientist with UMD NRRI, who has helped develop a formula that plants take in to help deter deer in mice. So that's a webinar coming up. So if you have other questions, feel free to type them in for Tony. As we're waiting, I have a number of announcements. Our SFEC calendar of events for next year is coming. Receive a copy in the mail, electronic copy. We have over 20 programs placed for next year. We'd look forward to your participation. Tony will be presenting at we have a couple intermediate sand treatment field day follow-ups that follow the workshop that we had here in September that Tony had talked about. On January 18th, we have the Jack Pine Symposium. So the Jack Pine Symposium is here at the Cloquet Forestry Center. Very good agenda, so take a look at the agenda on the SFEC website. On February 22nd is the annual Forestry, Wildlife, and Natural Resource Research Review. That's always well received, so this will be the 8th time. Up-to-date research from university researchers and Forest Service researchers here at the Cloquet Forestry Center. The Minnesota SAF is having an annual conference meeting the day after the review. That's February 23rd, but their banquet is on the 22nd that evening. We have a new workshop on March 15th, Restoration of Permanent Openings at Bemidji State University. I'm working with the Chippewa National Forest, Tom Hewitt, looking at permanent right-of-ways and how those right-of-ways can be restored without essentially using chemicals and other ways of preventing invasives. So it should be a good one. We have a whole series of new webinars coming up, so take a look at the calendar of events. Anyone is interested in the Ecological Classification System Certificate Series will begin again in 2012, so we have a waiting list of people. The class is filled. Let us know.
Anybody doesn't feel like typing in a question, if you do have any at any point, whenever, just feel free to send me an email or give me a call. My email is SFEC website, or get it off the Department of Forest Resources webpage as well.
We have a poll that we'd like participants to click on. Marty's going to bring that up. And if you can just give us an indication of your preferences for webinars, go through the poll. It's very quick. Give us an idea of how you like webinars and for the future. So appreciate that. Tony, I want to thank you for a really good presentation again. You're always right on the cutting edge. And thank you very much. Good job to see from one of our participants. But I'll look forward to hearing you in the future on some of your other research and teachings. So thanks again, Tony, and have a really good Christmas and happy holidays. And same to all of you as you leave us. Happy holidays. Looking forward to seeing many of you in the upcoming year. So if you have any questions or concerns, feel free to give me a call. Any questions about stewardship credits, contact myself or Lisa. Lisa Brewer is the person in our office. She may be your first contact. So, see any questions? No? Okay. I see 100% of you would like to see to view other webinars. Good. The way to learn, 67% of you. About 78% of you have attended 1 to 5 webinars. 3 of you, this is your first webinar. And 94% would recommend webinars to others. You attend, 41% attend about 4 to 6 webinars per year. So it's a way of getting out information without having to travel, so it's a lower cost alternative. Not the preferred way, but it is an opportunity to get some cutting edge information out to people. So we'll continue with webinars next year, and we look forward to having you online. So thanks again, Tony, for your webinar presentation, and thank you, Marty, for your technical support.
Yeah,
And
thanks,
happy
everybody.
holidays. Okay. Happy holidays to everyone.